Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. My name's Anthony Hobley. I serve as Executive Director of the Mission Possible platform, a partnership between the World Economic Forum, the Energy Transitions Commission, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and the We Mean Business coalition, whose purpose is to sort of convene expertise and critical mass to drive the decarbonisation of these so-called harder to abate heavy industry and transport sectors. I'm joined today by a couple of very old friends and a new friend, Alice Chapple, who I've worked together in a previous role at the Carbon Tracker initiative, and similarly Tim Buckley, who I've also worked together in the past whilst at Carbon Tracker, looking at coal and the energy transition, and a very new friend I'm delighted to sort of work with now and have this conversation with, Yannick. And Yannick, please correct me if I fail to pronounce this correctly. Beaudoin?
Beaudoin, but it's good.
That'll do. I'm going to ask each of my dear friends on the panel to introduce themselves, and then we're going to have a conversation about climate finance. Really, what it is, what's the role, and how climate finance can really help us address the climate emergency and drive climate action. Alice.
Perfect. Thank you, Anthony. Great to be with you all. So my name's Alice Chapple. I set up a company called Impact Value about 10 years ago, which is designed to help funds, financial institutions, NGOs, companies to drive capital towards impactful activities. And I also run a course for Cambridge for sustainable finance. And as Anthony mentioned, I have been on the Carbon Tracker board and on the Planet Tracker board, both of which are trying to push investment towards more sustainable activities. So look forward to talking more in a few minutes.
Thank you, Alice. And Yannick?
Bonjour à tous. So my name is Yannick Beaudoin. I'm a Director General with the David Suzuki Foundation in Canada. I'm also an economist with the foundation. So I come at this, of course, also with about a decade of working with the UN as a senior manager in a center in Norway. So loving to interconnect the Canadian and Norwegian stories today, and a very big pleasure to be here with everybody.
Wonderful. And last but certainly by no means least, Tim.
Thank you. G'day from Sydney. I'm Tim Buckley. I'm with IEEFA, the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, and we look at the energy finance climate nexus, and we're looking at the role of finance in the global energy markets and how, as finance moves, as finance acknowledges stranded asset risk and looks at the opportunity in renewable energy and industries of the future, how the financial markets will play an absolutely key role in enabling the energy transition. Thanks, Anthony.
Wonderful. Wow. And I've realized we're coming at you from 3 different continents. So you really are going to get the full perspective here. So perhaps, we're talking about climate finance, but I think it's probably, worth really anchoring ourselves first in what is finance. What is the finance sector? Maybe Alice, if you could talk a little bit about, what is the role of the finance sector in the global economy?
Yeah, so I think very broadly speaking, 3 big chunks of the finance sector: banks, insurance companies, and investors, and they each have a role in climate finance and in driving funding towards the right things or managing the risk. The banks clearly are funding large projects, and also so are big investors. The insurers are trying to work out how to insure the risks that arise from climate change. I think the point that I would really make is that these are the companies that are holding some of our assets, but it's us that are putting the money into those. So the people who are funding all of these things, it's not some amorphous finance sector doing something. We are putting our money into the banks, into savings products, into pension funds, into insurance companies, and it's us that can change the finance sector, can actually, if we can get to the bottom of it, decide how that finance is used for climate. So I think that's a fundamental point, I think, about the finance sector. It isn't amorphous, it isn't something that's somewhere else. It's us that has put our money in the finance sector.
Okay, so but emissions have to be financed. I mean, we often talk about finance and the low carbon transition, but on the other side of that equation, you actually have to finance the emissions themselves. And so, coal plants, coal pipelines, they all need money. So Yannick, I mean, do you think that the financial sector has actually helped cause the climate emergency?
I think it builds a little bit also with what Alice was sort of starting. Money itself has no particular direction, right? Positive, negative, whatever. It just goes where we tell it to go. So I think it's not necessarily pointing the fingers at finance itself, but on how we've used it over the last few decades, right? Where we've chosen to invest in something irrespective of the public good or the public bad. And I think that's where it's been a bit of that challenge. How do we give it that purpose? How do we kind of constrain to sort of say, well, when there is a negative societal cost, it has to somehow be reflected. And for the most part of the last few decades, all of those things have been like externalities to the system. And I think that's the kind of blind spots where finance itself, that money, that capital, when we're not giving it that good directionality, we're creating those blind spots. And then now we notice years later, oh my gosh, there actually is a climate cost. There's something physical that's changing around us that's no longer acceptable.
Thank you, Yannick. I mean, when you and I are ordinary people, many of those people listening to this, many teachers who put their money into, university or school or education pensions, they don't get much choice in where that money goes or how it's deployed, and probably, they don't get a lot of advice on that, or quite often, and I've heard this many times, you're told that if you put your money into green or clean investments, you will pay a price. You won't get as big a return on your pension. So Tim, is climate finance a way of shifting that position and shifting the balance from financing the bad to financing the good? I mean, if I put it in very simple terms.
Absolutely. And maybe to pick up on a phrase that Yannick referenced, externality. To me, it's all about the financial markets are brilliant at pricing in risk, but at the moment, or prior to 2020, climate risk was an externality. There was an uncosted impact that business has on the economy and our planet. And when and if the global market prices in carbon emissions as a cost of doing business, I am exceptionally bullish about the ability of finance to shift radically and very, very fast in solving the problem, because as soon as you price in a cost, the business will work to solve the problem, and finance is able to shift literally overnight into the right area. So to me, the really pleasing aspect, how we exited 2020, and even better, how we've accelerated from the starting post in 2021 with the appointment or the election of President Biden. We've now got all of the major economies talking about pricing in an externality, the key externality to the financial markets. And so as soon as the financial markets accept that, which I believe they did last year, I think we're now absolutely on a race to solving the climate problem. We've still got a huge way to go, but finance is this enormous, amorphous mass, to use Alice's words, and it is also a very, very powerful force. It's unstoppable once it moves.
Just stay with you for a moment. I mean, you've been tracking the sort of energy transition and the scaling up of clean technologies, particularly the energy space, and the role of sort of coal and so on, for a while, and you're one of the preeminent analysts in the space and have been at the forefront of this for quite a while. So do you think this idea that deploying your money to tackle climate, within green funds, climate tilted funds, ESG funds, this idea that somehow that is a less attractive investment than so-called traditional investments? Do you think that that's now wrong? Do you think that we've now reached a place where actually a climate finance might be a better financial investment than you know, a business as usual investment, for want of a better expression?
Yeah, maybe to call out a name, I'll reference my response by referencing BlackRock. 3-4 years ago, they were absolutely unfocused on this issue. They did not see it as their moral or fiduciary duty to manage an externality, to manage a key global financial risk. As Mark Carney, the Bank of England governor, put it, they said their job was to maximize their risk-adjusted returns. Now, that tune started to change going into Davos 3 years ago when the deputy chair of BlackRock said, it is now our fiduciary duty to consider that if it doesn't cost us anymore, then we should do the right thing in terms of climate risk. Now, fast forward 1 year, 14 months, and Larry Fink's 2020 letter referenced that it is actually costing investors to not deal with this key financial risk. And BlackRock, a company that had prided itself never on divesting, actually announced they would divest thermal coal with almost immediate effect, and they did. And then you fast forward to January 2021, and Larry Fink's letter to every CEO in the world is entirely focused on environmental, social, and governance, and within that, the key elephant in the room, climate risk. So Larry Fink was saying what started out pretty aggressively in 2020 has now become a tsunami of reallocation of global capital into low emissions industries of the future. And so a $9 trillion giant is talking about a tsunami of capital moving now very aggressively in the right direction. So added to where everything else the world is happening and all of the national pledges that we're seeing, or because of the national pledges, global finance is now acting as a tsunami of change in helping solve this critical problem.
Thanks, Tim. Come back to you, Alice. So in your view, what is the role of climate finance in tackling in creating climate action and tackling the climate emergency?
Well, we know we have to have a lot more money flowing into climate related activities, whether that's mitigation. So it's trying to make sure that we are not putting more carbon into the atmosphere, and we're trying to replace the carbon heavy industries and activities with lower carbon equivalents. We have to get to net zero by 2050 or before in order to not have dangerous climate change. So that's the big part of climate finance, is trying to drive capital away from the industries which are really carbon intensive and towards the ones that are much less so. It's also really important that climate finance funds the adaptation. We know that we've already got to a point where there are massive climate impacts, which, whatever happens now, there is the carbon in the atmosphere, we are going to have very devastating climate impact. So trying to protect people, particularly in developing countries, against the worst effects of that is another really important part of climate finance. So both of those need a lot of funding. And I, like Tim, am really encouraged by the amount of money flowing in. But the question is it far enough? Is it fast enough? You know, we know there's a long way to go to get the scale and the urgency that's really needed. I think it's so great to see that tipping point that Tim talked about around things are beginning to change because people are perceiving the risk. But there's still people investing in fossil fuels. There's still oil coming out of the ground. There's still coal being burnt in many places, and it's hard to see how that transition can happen far enough and fast enough. So we need to keep plugging on and finding ways for climate finance to be allocated to both to mitigation and to adaptation.
Interesting. So, but is there more of a structural issue here in our global economic and financial system? So Yannick, maybe coming back to you, I mean, is climate finance, what's that expression? I'm bound to get it wrong, but sort of fiddling while Rome burns, in a sense, tinkering around the edges, because our global economic and financial system in a sense is structurally, it's not structurally designed to deal with externalities. It's not structurally designed to deal with coming up against resource constraints. It's designed for perpetual growth. So can climate finance really solve this problem within the construct of the current economic and financial system, or is it more fundamental than that?
I mean, it's never going to be that simple one answer silver bullet, right? I mean, a market system exists in a societal system, exists in our democracies or our governance structures. And I think all of those aspects have to be kind of looked at when you're trying to change, okay, where are we going with this? I mean, I always come back sometimes to the acid rain treaties in North America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where at the time there was a political decision and regulation came in. But if you look at how the finance shifted because of that and with that, so it's almost like what's behind the finance will push the river in the direction you want to go. And a lot of that, as was brought up, it is about, you know, democracy, democratizing finance itself. Like how do we influence our pension funds? How do we have a say, a voice, a transparency? Because then that does give that power to sort of say, okay, we currently have a market system that's pretty unregulated, kind of free,
yep,
and growth forever. Doesn't have to be like that. What would we want it to be, right? How do we want it to be in service of a particular outcome, rather than this kind of like, we don't really have an outcome, we just want to continue down the river. So I think it is a partly technical answers, partly looking at the structures of finance, but also looking at how it sits, that system, that sector, within the broader societal context, and where is the power to influence and reimagine and innovate and redesign those systems.
So this requires, you know, I mean, to do that, you know, this is not something the financial institutions can do on their own. This needs government intervention, government policy, government frameworks, the right support mechanisms. Whether that's, you know, in the current conversations around, you know, economic stimulus post-COVID, green stimulus, and you know, we've seen something quite ambitious on this in Europe, although many would argue not ambitious enough. So how can, you know, what do governments need to do to make climate finance more attractive? And I'm going to ask Tim on that one. But you know, I'm sure Yannick and Alice have views on that.
So climate, what can governments do? What can communities do? At the end of the day, communities can pressure their financial institutions, and Yannick will take us through that a bit later in this call, but you can also have the government set the right framework. Again, as Yannick referenced, the aim of the government is to set the market framework, to set the regulations, to price the key externalities into the market, and then get out of the way and let the market deal with it. And I am a believer that the financial markets are very powerful and very much able to deal with this problem. They just need the right price signal. And so I think maybe as a data point, we saw last year, and it goes to your earlier question, Anthony, we saw last year Exxon's share price drop 40% in a market overall that went up. Now, why do I pick on Exxon? Exxon 20 years ago was the world's largest company. It was a $500 billion giant. And fast forward to the end of 2021, and it was a $200 billion giant. It had destroyed $300 billion of its shareholders' money in the process of 2 decades of funding climate denialism. So that I mentioned that as a data point to highlight the financial markets really latched on to key financial risk last year, 2020, and the collapse of Exxon to me is the evidence of how financial markets are looking at stranded asset risk, which we'll come to, in a very, very different light at the end of 2020 as to what they were at the start of the year. And so ultimately, it's about the financial markets saying, if the governments of the world collectively price in externality on carbon, we are going to be left financing a whole lot of assets that are not viable, are not needed, are not of any commercial value, and they're called stranded assets, and effectively those assets are worthless. And only in Australia just this week, like Australia's biggest energy company yesterday, AGL Energy, just wrote off $2.3 billion. They had purchased Australia's largest coal-fired power plants about 5 years ago. 10 years ago, they'd been making huge profits for 5 or 10 years. And now they said, oh, we've been amazed at the speed of change evident just in the last 6 to 12 months. And assets that were earning the company $1 billion profit a year are now on the path to zero value. And so the company wrote them down to $2.3 billion just yesterday. And that was a string of 5 different companies this week in Australia, 5 different coal-fired power generation companies in Australia writing down their coal-fired power plants, because the world has changed. The world is now moving inevitably to price in carbon risk, and financial markets like corporates hate risk. So the financials are moving very, very rapidly away. So that's why I'm bullish. Financial markets with the right external signals from the governments, from the community, will move very rapidly.
Okay, well, let's stick with this, because I mean, this is very close to the sort of the theory of change and the approach that the Mission Possible Partnership is espousing. Because I mean, we've come a long way. I mean, and particularly in the last few years, a considerable way in the energy transition. But it's taken, what, 30 or 40 years to get where we are now with wind and solar, you know, and the costs having come down. And even now, you know, we're struggling to roll out those technologies at the speed that is required. And you know, the good news is we're seeing similar S-curves of development for batteries, electric vehicles. And now, you know, government's starting to send signals with phase outs for the sale of internal combustion engines. But we've only got 30 years now to get to net zero. And, you know, emissions are still, even with the COVID crisis, they're still on average going up. So how do we accelerate that whole process? I mean, how do we map it out? I mean, one of the things that we've got in Mission Possible platform for the harder to abate sectors is a 4-step process. Build faster moving coalitions of companies, you know, suppliers, buyers, finance, governments, get them to develop the right roadmap, 30-year roadmaps, get them to commit to the key milestones, and then work on all the supporting, you know, mechanisms, product standards, the right financial instruments, and so on. But it's that roadmap against which you need to measure your transition to net zero, because that's where we have to get to. We have to be at net zero, certainly in the developed world by 2050, and the developing world by 2060. So that's our target. So how do we mobilize finance against those benchmarks, those roadmaps? And clearly, some technologies are ready for the private sector to invest in. Some are coming out of the R&D stage, but there's a lot of risk. So, you know, we need to de-risk those. And some still need a lot of government support. If you think, I mean, it's more complex than that, but those are the 3 stages of technology for financing purposes. So how do we accelerate that and get the governments to support that? Maria Mazzucato, the economist at UCL, I think is changing the thinking, isn't she? That, you know, a lot of these technologies we believe the market developed, that are in our iPhones and in our computers and everything we use, actually have all come out of government support and government funding programs. So how do we accelerate that and get this sort of flywheel of public, private and civil society driving the systems change at the speed we need and get that financed? Not an easy question, but maybe, you know, yeah. Alice.
Well, it is the essential question, isn't it, about how it feels sort of almost anathema to us, so used to the private sector making the market sort of answering the questions that it needs to answer, that, you know, the prices will work out if the market is allowed to find it. Because of the externalities that we've been talking about, we know that's not the case. So actually, we do have to have these sort of national development plans, you call them roadmaps. We have to have quite a clear vision of what needs to happen in different sectors in order to be able to deliver net zero by 2050. If we don't have that, then we can't innovate into that space. As you say, some markets, you know, solar magnificently has become cost equivalent to some of the high carbon energy industries, but energy generation. But a lot of other sectors just aren't there yet. So government has to be very almost directional, although it's directional about innovation, it's not directional about the delivery, because that then has to pass on to the private sector. And it seems to me that balance between government supporting and then going, we're not the best people to deliver, but we know that other people have. And just on that government thing, I think the other point I wanted to make was, as citizens, you know, governments are stretched no end, to, especially post-COVID, to try and work out how on earth they can balance their books. We as citizens have to give them a bit more sort of support for the fact that actually climate change is top of our agenda too. So if there's a problem with government saying, well, we'd love to do more on climate change, but there's a lot of other things that are on our to-do list, we have to, as citizens, sort of give them support in making sure that feels like it's top of their agenda, I think. But yes, lots of things that government can do in order that the private sector can then come in, and we may talk a bit about how the blending of public and private finance can be more effective. But I think, yes, that's such a crucial part.
I think there's a lot of evidence, isn't there, from the last financial crisis, 2008, 2009, that the stimulus that did get spent in green industries actually had a much bigger impact in creating jobs and sustainable wealth than money spent on high carbon investments. I mean, money spent in the US under the Obama sort of stimulus package on renewables and Tesla and on ensuring the automotive sector there produce more fuel efficient cars was much more successful in creating jobs, for example. So and hopefully that lesson will be learned this time around. So maybe a question for all of the panelists. I mean, so we're seeing this momentum. We're seeing a huge amount of focus on this and climate ambition, even in the COVID crisis in 2020 and 2021. A massive uptick in both governments and corporates taking on net zero commitments. I mean, I think I saw some analysis that 1.5 degrees on net zero commitments are outpacing 2 degrees commitments by 2 to 1. So clearly there's a sort of ambition, a long way to go still, but it's a big step change. So can each of you give, maybe starting with Tim and going backwards in our order, give me an example of the most exciting development that you've seen in the last year in the climate finance space?
Absolutely. And I might preface that and just follow up on a point that Alice made. To me, working in this area for the last decade, we saw almost no financial response to the Paris Agreement, which was devastating. The Paris came out and we looked at the stock market and there was no price response on any magnitude. Fast forward to 2020, there was enormous price response, and it's a bit counterintuitive. It's to do, I think, with the COVID issue is all about a global pandemic. It's a global problem and it requires a global solution. And it's about accepting the medical science. And I think that might have been the catalyst for why we've all of a sudden globally woken up in 2021 and corporates, governance, the people, even finance is starting to accept the science of climate change. Now, the evidence has been mounting every year for 40 years, but when Exxon, the funder of global climate science denial for the last 30 years, shares go through the floor and now the CEO is having trouble holding on to his chair, that's, to me, a sign of the inevitability of the change. So getting to your question, Anthony, the most exciting thing, my main market is India. And part of why I do that is because the Indian government is all in on energy transition. And also India is the third largest electricity market in the world. It will soon be the largest country in the world by population. It's the largest growing emerging market by a country mile. And so for all those reasons, what India does will drive the outcome of Paris. They didn't cause the problem, common but differentiated responsibilities, but Prime Minister Modi is very happy to deliver the world's solution if he can get access to enough capital. And so the most exciting thing I saw last year was, it happened in December, and it was a solar tender. It was 10 times oversubscribed by global capital, and the price of the tender was 1.99 rupees a kilowatt hour, down 15% in just 6 months, and it's down 85% in the last 5 years, but down 15% in just 6 months, and it is now below the marginal fuel cost of running a coal-fired power plant in India. Now, that is the second tipping point, not the first tipping point where solar gets to grid parity. Solar has gone through grid parity, straight through massive deflation, and is now below the marginal fuel cost of putting coal into a coal plant that already exists. So to me, my question would be, who would ever finance another new coal-fired power plant anywhere in the world? because that second tipping point is critical. It effectively means every coal plant in the world is on a path to losing money within the next 5-10 years. And that is the sort of dramatic change we need to change the world. And the beauty of it, India is going to lead the world.
I've got to pick up on this because I think, but we're still seeing tenders for coal-fired power stations in many countries in Southeast Asia and so on. But isn't the problem that on a level playing field, clean energy is now cost competitive, in fact, if not cheaper, as you rightly point out. The problem is, in many markets, the governments are still subsidizing coal, which for many of us who've been in this space for many years and had to put up with being told for years that renewables only works if it's subsidized, is quite a sweet shift. Coal only works if it's subsidized. But isn't this, this is still part of the problem in many markets. The market is still not seeing that cost competitiveness because, the fossil fuels, particularly coal, is still being subsidized.
Absolutely. If you throw enough subsidies at anything is viable. But the beauty of it, and I have to admit, I'm partisan. I am very biased. I think President Biden is doing an unbelievable job. He's moving it far faster than anyone thought possible. And let me call out two things in his climate executive order from last week that got me very excited. To the point you just made, Anthony. He said he will mandate that the American government immediately stop all fossil fuels for good, all fossil fuel subsidies for good, sorry, a key word, subsidies. So the American government, like the Australian government, has been subsidizing fossil fuels for decades, massively, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies. He has mandated with the executive order that all fossil fuel subsidies have to cease immediately. That's step number one. Step number two is equally important. He then mandated that every government finance organization in America must cease fossil fuel capital subsidies for the export market, because it's not the developing world that's latching onto coal. It's actually the developed world that's pushing export credit agencies in Japan, Korea, America, and China and Britain until December, pushing fossil fuel subsidies in their finance. So if you're trying to build a new power plant, you need finance. If you're sitting in the Philippines, you go to the Japanese government, they'll go, we would love to finance a new coal-fired power plant. That's unfortunately the end of the conversation. The coal plant gets built. Remove the fossil fuel subsidies, as President Biden just did, remove the export credit finance, and let the best technology win, and it's game over.
This should appeal to Republicans and Conservatives who's saving taxpayers' money. Yannick, what's your sort of most exciting development in the space in the last year?
Yeah, maybe building on one thing about coal plants, just to give you an example, Canada's largest coal plant is now a solar plant. So that's the ultimate irony, where coal is still there, the building's there, you can see it, and it's all a solar plant, the biggest we have. I think the most exciting things in the Canadian context of the last little while, one was clearly the fear now, the walking away, the rapid walking away of private capital with respect to anything oil and gas, new ventures, exploration, and of course pipelines, which is a big issue in Canada. And so of course we're still stuck with pipelines, and we have government that stepped in, but what it meant to me is a very clear sign that private finance is no longer seeing it as long-term viable. And the latest example of that was the previous president's attempt to open up the National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, and I think one small company even put in a claim. So there's no finance for that kind of work without any government support. The second is the recent announcement in North America from GM and Ford, helped and supported by both sides, governments from both sides of the border. Basically, both these companies are no longer going to produce fossil fuel powered vehicles after 2035, and there's rumors it'll even be sooner than that. So that's a big game changer in the demand side. So now we have a supply side and demand side. And the last one, which is a bit more cryptic and a bit more technical and probably deserves a lot more conversation, but carbon border adjustments. It's a very interesting element where finally, with the right players at the table, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, America now with President Biden here in Canada, now we're starting to have this idea that if you start exporting a fossil fuel heavy product somewhere else, there will actually now be a cost to you, even though you're the producer of it, you're not necessarily the consumer. So I think how that might go down in the next year or two, hopefully around the trade agreements, I think could be very, very important from that as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of conversations on carbon border tax adjustments in Europe. I understand even in Japan's just sort of tabled some proposals, and we know that in the US, there's now a group working on this in the new administration. So yeah, very, very exciting. I think that could be a very interesting development. Alice, what's your highlight of the year?
I think I would say that the shift from a sort of rather a woolly idea of ESG to something around net zero being the gauge by which pension funds should be measured is a pretty huge move, actually, because I think that in the past people have just been able to greenwash fudge a bit around what the ESG fund looks like. Now actually people are being held to account around how are you going to get to net zero? What is your climate finance strategy for moving that portfolio? And I think that's pretty large. So that's one. And I think, and again, it's a sort of quite a vague one that is my second one, but I think actually the sense that more people are thinking that they can take a stand and can move their money and can actually there is a bit of agency here that I can actually talk to my pension fund and tell them that I would rather they were net zero than they weren't. I think that's a change actually that I've seen, and it's been something we've been wanting for a very long time, isn't it? But and as you mentioned, Anthony, that often people feel, teachers' pension funds, they feel very divorced from them, but actually more engagement strategies, I think, now with pension funds for pension fund members to actually try and create that change, perhaps. So I think those are sort of things I've seen which are empowering people to make more moves, I think.
I do think that's trickling, that's sort of the reality of this change is trickling down to ordinary people, and I mean, an ordinary, financial advisors, pension advisors. Or yes. Do we have to do some capacity building there?
Yes, absolutely.
I'll chime in there, Anthony. The latest data for Australia highlighted that if you had an ESG or an ESG low carbon emissions portfolio in the last 5 years, MSCI data on a 5-year view said that you outperformed by 400 bips or 4% per annum compound over the last 5 years. Now, 1 year, it's a 1-year wonder. It's not a trend. 5 years, everyone's going to jump on that. And at 4% annual outperformance, that's game over. So to Alice's point, ESG is very wishy-washy and it's a little nebulous and it's very much at risk of greenwash. Net zero emissions and the massive outperformance of low emissions technology companies around the world in the last 5 years has now made it inevitable that every financial advisor cannot ignore climate finance risk.
That's a very good point, very well made. Yannick, I mean, the financial markets and finance is often associated with the 1%, the winners, whether that's countries or the highest stratas in society, the sort of 1%. How do we ensure that in this transition and in the scope of climate finance, that there is equity and justice, both for ordinary people, those who are not scions of the financial markets, but also for the developing world. How do we ensure that we in essence have a just transition, and what is the role? How can climate finance play a role in not just making the rich richer, but in a just transition where everybody benefits?
Yeah, wow, that's a question we could have a whole session on, independent of this. I think one of the first steps in my view, in my work, I mean, the financial sector is predominantly dominated by one culture, right? We have a challenge there with diversity at different levels, and I think having those conversations looking for solutions will have to involve some kind of a shift in where that diversity is, how it's involved, how it's empowered, not from a tokenism perspective, but from a new ideas perspective. I mean, I'm white, and I probably have a limitation of my imagination based on my cultural background. More solutions you want to have to recreate, redesign, reimagine finance will have to come from, by talking and including and imagining together with a variety of worldviews, a variety of cultural views. In Canada, a lot of the work and conversations with Indigenous partners, for example, is one aspect that can be brought into play to sort of say, well, what does finance of tomorrow look like? Is it still redesigned by the same 1% that comes from a particular cultural worldview? So I think that's one big start. And it's been a challenge, right? It really has been over the last decades globally. I mean, even in the UN, where I worked for many years, international development is again, a paradigm designed by one group. And that has limitations and constraints. So I think it's not about finger pointing all the time, but how can we create the inclusive spaces, not from a perspective of tokenism and we need 40% or half, but really from the idea that you get better and more ideas and innovation when you have that diversity right there at the table with you.
Well, Yannick, you raise a good point, and I think Mayor Culp, we probably have to also, acknowledge to our audience that, we probably need a bit more diversity on this panel and this conversation. I mean, we don't have anyone from the developing world. We, with all due respect to all of us, we probably don't have anyone who can provide a sort of younger perspective on what they want to see. And as you say, we can try and empathize, but we can't really put ourselves in those shoes. And I think that that's a really important perspective in this conversation that we really do need. So
Anthony, just to add to that, if I may, so we've got about 300 trillion of assets which can be invested, and we, under the Paris Agreement, we were told $100 billion a year should go to developing countries. We are spending not even that, and that's shocking. We've got to find a way to enable that money to flow more effectively to those markets. I mean, unless we do that, then we won't create a transition. We just won't achieve what we're planning to achieve. So in terms of Paris, there was that recognition that needed to be done. In COP26 in Glasgow, that has to be front and central as well, because unless we get more money flowing to those markets, in ways, absolutely take your point, Yannick, in ways that are decided where it should go by the people who are needing it, but we've failed unless we somehow manage to level that up, and it's obviously the people in the developing countries who are going to be affected the worst by climate change, as we know. So it's I think imperative on us to find a way not just to solve our own problems, but also help other people to have the funding for theirs.
I might pick up on that, Alice. I think that's an absolutely key point. One of the absolute failings initially of the Paris Agreement was exactly that, the point you made, that the Western countries collectively committed to investing $100 billion per year into a global clean finance fund. And I think France, Germany, and Obama managed to sneak in a little bit of money before he left the White House, and then the fund effectively fell over and they haven't deployed any capital of any substance. So it was an absolute failing by the OECD, and the developing countries were desperately calling for that capital because, go back to the common but differentiated responsibilities, they didn't cause the problem. They're the ones that need to be lifted out of poverty and need new energy sources. They need finance to drive that, and the West has failed them for 5 years now. And I saw that, and probably no more telling than the Energy Minister of India, Piyush Goyal, went around the world for a year, cap in hand, on behalf of the Indian people, saying, I need to raise hundreds of billions of dollars of capital to deploy. And all of the global governments effectively ignored him, except for France. Now, he didn't come back to press because he's my favorite Indian politician. He came back motivated. What he accidentally stumbled on was, well, the Western governments don't have a lot of money, but the people that do are the pension plans. And he came back, he created some products, they're 25-year government-backed PPAs, power purchase agreements, and he now has a wall of global private capital flooding into India. And India, so Piyush Goyal, I'll give him a shout out, he's moved on from energy, he's now the rail minister, but he created a tsunami of capital change into the Indian market, where India had been a very closed financial system, And he sort of found a loophole. He didn't open up the whole financial system, but he opened up the inflow of capital into renewable energy infrastructure. And we estimate that India will probably see $500 billion of capital flows just this decade alone from global capital. And we just put out a report this week on that. And the list of global institutions flowing capital into India, building capacity. Now, it's not just India. India becomes the role model for every other emerging market because they've created the legal framework, the government policy framework that's unlocked that global capital. And that global capital is the thing that drove the 15% solar price deflation in just 6 months. So the reward for the people of India is massive, deflationary, clean, zero emissions energy that's produced in India. It's not imported, it's not heavy carbon, and it's not fossil fuels. And so they're actually solving energy security, and they're delivering deflation for the poor people of India. That lifts 1 billion people out of poverty, and it's a virtuous cycle. Unbelievable that finance could actually do something good.
Well, indeed. And so, but what can ordinary people do to drive this change? I mean, before, you know, the current sort of COVID crisis and the lockdowns many of us are currently in, although probably not you, Tim, your country's doing quite well in that respect, but for many of us, that we saw a lot of mobilization. You know, the Greta effect, the Extinction Rebellion. Before that, we saw a lot of the campaigns in universities to stop investments in fossil fuels. So sort of the stranded assets type demonstrations and the sort of divestment campaigns, actually, created by the formal organisation a number of us are involved in, the Carbon Tracker Initiative. So how can climate finance be mobilised through such campaigns? How can we build on those? And maybe start with you, Tim, but I'm sure Yannick and Alice, you will have perspectives on this. But we've seen we still see this fight around the Adani coal mine in Australia, and there's been a lot of campaigns there. I mean, we've seen actually, and Yannick, you will probably have views in terms of the pipelines in North America, where we've seen a lot of campaigns. What is the role of campaigns here, and do they really make a difference, and can they really drive the behaviour of the financial markets and financial institutions?
I'd also throw in the student climate strikes on Friday. Certainly from what I've seen, and what Greta Thunberg from Sweden has illustrated, is the power of one person is phenomenal when they're on a mission. And there's nothing more powerful than the youth moving today and showing and exerting their voice, because it's all about intergenerational equity. It's not our problem. It'll be our children's problem and their children's problem. So we need to understand the voice of the children. But remember, every board member in the world generally has children and grandchildren. And so it's the power of their voice going home and talking to their family, and then demanding intergenerational equity, that they take responsibility for the actions of our generation so that we don't pass this legacy on. But maybe outside of my domain, but I've watched the amazing efforts of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and the climate strikes on Friday, and it's just inspiring to me. And I just love listening to them talk, because they're so eloquent and they're so motivated and such an impact. But and every one of them have parents and have brothers and sisters and can talk to their own financial institutions and demand action. And you don't need too many people to be standing outside a bank to get the board's attention. So that would, and Adani, the Stop Adani campaign, I think, has been an example of that, where Australia has millions of people across a coalition of maybe 20 or 30 NGOs. And so we've got the farmers group, Lock the Gate. We've got the traditional owners group in Seed and the W&J people. And we've got the all sorts of different, the Australian Conservation Foundation representing the older white demographic in Australia. So all these coalitions have come together. They've got millions of members in Australia, and that campaign's been going now for a decade. And okay, the mine will get built, but it'll be a sixth of the size of what it originally planned to be. It'll probably run for 20 years maximum rather than the 90 years that Qatar Madani wanted. But ultimately, that strike has been phenomenally effective because Qatar Madani is now pivoting his own thinking. He came out last year and acknowledged that renewables are the future, and he now has invested billions of dollars in renewables, and he's all in on low energy, low emissions technologies of the future. He's the biggest developer of renewables in India from a standing start in the last 5 years. So he's already given up on coal, and unfortunately the Carmichael coal mine, or fortunately, it's a stranded asset, and I'm sure he wishes he never heard of Australia 10 years ago, because he's made so much money. He's made himself 10 or 15 billion dollars in renewables, and there's nothing more motivating for a billionaire than to make lots and lots of billions doing the right thing for the planet and for his own country.
Well, that's a great sentiment there to hand over to Yannick. Some of the experience I think we've seen in North America with the pipeline campaigns.
For sure. And I think, I mean, this is also, like, I know that our audience is kind of in the education or educator teacher field. And so it's also a role that education and teaching can now play in this space. So one of the, every time I interact sometimes with the banking sector, the financial sector, there's an interesting side fear sometimes, as if the average person knew too much about how the system worked, we'd be really screwed. And so I think that's something, you know, when we look at the youth movements across Canada, there's a lot more conversation around divestment, but not just divestment for the word. Now they're actually starting to ask the right questions, like, what does divestment do? Like, what do you mean? Who's divesting? Where does it go? And now, as they get deeper and deeper into that, they're starting to realize, hey, wait a minute, there's money, there's power in the money that's in my pocket. How interesting is that, right? And I think as youth, especially in Canada, US, where it's becoming millennials, Gen Z, now becoming the dominant demographic. Now, of course, they don't tend to vote a lot. If they did, right, and some politicians are not paying attention to this, if there starts to be a mobilization around that, and that becomes now the biggest voting bloc in Canada, what does that mean if they actually understand how the system works and how their money, literally, and the choices they make with it can actually have a profound impact? So one example is, of course, you're used to opening up a bank account in the traditional banks, but what happens if you're opening up bank accounts in your cooperative banks, your local banks, your B Corp banks? We have a B Corp bank here in Canada called Van City, for example. That's a very, very different place. You get the same services, you even get the same rates of return, but you're not participating in specifically perhaps climate negative investments because the bank doesn't have an investment division. But it can still give you a mortgage, it can still give you all those things. So I think there's starting to be a realization that you, as Alice started at the whole beginning of all this, understanding where money comes from, how capital flows in basic terms, not going down into the nitty gritty and all the Excel spreadsheets and all that stuff, but just as teachers being able to convey in a classroom, let's just talk about money, would be already, and you're starting to see it, can have a big impact on the democratic power of how your money speaks and where it goes. And with millennials and Gen Z now becoming that dominant demographic, that could have, it's already being noticed in the financial sector. But I think there's still this idea that, you know, the curtain and the wizard, they're still, the curtain's still there. We're just starting to peel it. Let's peel it a bit more. And then you really start to see those youth movements having that extra power, the extra boost. And kind of like Alice has started, we know this is happening. The decarbonization is happening. It's a question of how quickly. This would add to the how quickly.
Yes, and I think in terms of the campaigns, that it just shows that you can have different sorts of campaigns for different things, can't you? So everybody wants to campaign to say we must get to net zero, and there's a sort of a mood music that we need to be sure that governments hear that, and that, you know, that's a, but there's also very specific campaigns either about divestment or about moving your bank account. But then there's other campaigns about how can we work with some of these organizations and buy the right things, buy the right products, buy the right you know, the things that people are going to invest in, and that's another way to shift the way that money goes, because investors are only going to invest in companies that make money. So I think there's a whole range of different, more sophisticated sort of actions, campaigns that people can have. Some are big, blunt instruments around, the sort of Extinction Rebellion type of thing, which gets attention, and then others are more sophisticated, aren't they? More targeted, more specific, which are all very powerful, different levers to pull.
Well, exactly. And maybe a final word, Alice, because you teach a course, and then I'll do my best to sort of wrap up what I think has been a sort of a landscape tour of climate finance in our conversation. But what would be your advice? And you teach climate finance at the University of Cambridge on the sustainability course, CIST course. What would be your one piece of advice to the teachers and lecturers that are watching this?
I think it's probably picking up things that Yannick has said about the demystifying the finance sector is the most important thing, isn't it? I would say, and Tim's steeped in the finance sector and really knows what makes it tick. And I think making sure that it's not seen as a sort of you can't engage with it because it's something we don't understand. It sort of let's really unpick what it's about and why it works the way it does. And actually, if it doesn't work to drive money towards climate finance, then what are the specific things that we can do? And we've explored a lot of those in this call. I think there's such a lot of optimism that I'm hearing from everybody on this call about that where we're going. So I think talking to teachers and other educators around, just give people an opportunity to explore what it is that they can do to engage with the finance system without thinking it's scary, because it's not scary. It's supposed to be working for us. That's the point. The finance system is supposed to be helping the real economy, people, businesses actually do better. And if it doesn't, then it needs to be told to do it. And I think that's the thing that we need to all work on more, isn't it?
Needs to be told to do it. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. I mean, it has been a tour de force through what is the financial sector? Has finance actually been part of the problem? And is climate finance part of the solution? So the two sides of the coin. We've touched on its role in tackling the climate emergency, getting us to net zero, doing what it's meant to do, which is manage, risk and return. And I think we're hearing a very positive message that actually, you can get a better return now through investing, for good to tackle the climate emergency than if you invest in the things that cause climate change. And so, it can be part of solving the problem, but probably, not on its own. We need some re-engineering of our economic and financial system, and that there's a very important role for governments. Maria Mentzakute at the UCL is obviously starting to really, I think, surface the fact that governments have always had a big role in funding transitions and technologies. These things, don't happen in a vacuum without government support, and we need to acknowledge that and understand how to accelerate that to get these, implement these net zero roadmaps over the next 30 years. And so governments can make climate finance more attractive, but also, I think to your point, Tim, and the conversation we had, is actually investing in the right things can save taxpayers money, can save governments money. So this should appeal to the sort of fiscally conservative out there, because it's the bad things that have to be subsidized now, like coal. The clean technologies can actually make us money, and I think that's a really important point. And we've had some great examples of some very exciting developments in the last year that I think give us all hope that we're on the right track, but we've got to accelerate that more. And let's not forget equity and justice. And I think on panels like this, we need more diversity. We need more voices from more diverse cultures, countries, and communities, and also age as well, because this is it's our children and grandchildren. They're going to feel the worst effects, albeit I think we're beginning to suffer many of those already, and there's a real role, you know, the money in your pocket can make a difference. So you can mobilize and use money as a tool. Even individuals, you know, the Greta effect could perhaps be applied in the financial markets as well. You know, and we've seen a lot of campaigns that have helped to stop or at least, you know, mitigate some of the worst investments coming down the pipe, like Adani and many of the pipelines in North America. You know, so a great conversation, and I think we finished with some really good advice on, you know, how teachers and lecturers can really, you know, make a difference through communicating and through teaching some of these incredibly important issues. So thank you, Alice and Yannick and Tim. This has been a really enjoyable conversation. I've learned a huge amount. So, you know, thank you very much.
Thank
and
you,
thank you to
Anthony.
everybody, you know, everybody who takes the time to watch and listen to us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks,
Brilliant.
Tim. Thanks, Yannick.
Yeah, so good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are, and thank you very much.